All right. Can you guys see that? Does that come up for you? Yes. Okay. Looks like it's a yes. All right. So I'll just sort of dive in here. Happy to be here. Happy to be back. I will admit I have not been back to Oneonta in quite some time, so it's nice to be back even just virtually. And thank you to Tracy for the invitation. I took one of Tracy's courses. I think, Tracy, this was maybe your first or second year. I can't remember. It was very early when you would come over to SUNY Oneonta. So yes, second. So everyone was very excited about her classes. And then we all took them and realized they were the hardest courses that were taught in the department. And we all appreciated that from Tracy. So those are of many memories that I have there. So when the folks asked me for a title for this, I sort of defaulted to something that I actually say quite a bit, which is that I feel like I use anthropology every day and have since I left Oneonta. That's not just something I put up here because I'm giving a presentation, but truly I have always thought that and said that, and I'm happy to share with you sort of where I've been since leaving. So I guess just a little bit about me, which is always a fun place to start. I like to think about myself and my career as really being about problem solving. And I look across all of the different jobs I've held and places I've been, which we'll obviously get into. I think the common thread that ties it all together is really about problem solving. I've particularly fallen in love with solving problems at scale, so very, very large problems, not one at a time problems, but problems where you can actually have the opportunity to impact lots and lots of people all at once. I currently am based between New York and Paris. I'm currently in Paris right now. But I spend a lot of my time going back and forth, and this is something that I've been able to do in the last 2 years. So we can also talk about that if anybody's trying to move to a different country. I think ultimately, and this is sort of the last bullet here, I think I've come to develop a little bit of a theory of how you can go about solving really complex problems. And to me, it's really been at the intersection of thinking about things as systems, not as standalone institutions or standalone problems. I'm really thinking about how do you do collaborative problem solving and how do you do that well? How do you use data to inform your solutions? And how do you bring processes?
Juliette, can't hear you.
Oh, can you hear me now? Oh no.
Yep. Oh,
you're good.
There it is.
Okay. Just cut in now. No worries. And I think the last thing I would just say is how do you bring really good ideas and processes across different sectors? And you'll see a little bit about why I talk about that and why that's been a part of my own career journey. So how did I get here? I think this is sort of wanting to tell a little bit of a story of sort of like, how did I end up at SUNY Oneonta? How did I end up in anthropology? And then how did I end up doing the things that I've done since? I would say years 0 to 16 are fairly uninteresting to cover in this presentation. But I actually, I graduated high school when I was 16. I moved around a lot as a kid and through some of that just ended up graduating high school early. And I wasn't really feeling heading right into college. I felt like I was very young at the time. And so I actually had the opportunity to take a gap year. And I spent a year living in Morocco, which is in North Africa. And I sort of just like want to say that because I think now looking back on all of that and looking back at how much it's influenced so much of how I think about the world in my experiences, I think if I could like go back in time, it's the single best decision I ever made was to really take some time and go see what other people are up to, go see how other cultures and other countries are doing things. It very much opened my horizons in a way that I think college is definitely one way. Obviously, you get to know different people and different folks of different backgrounds, but I think traveling and living abroad is really something that I encourage all of you to do, even if it's just a semester. If you possibly can do it for a year, I definitely encourage it. I do think that obviously you're also living in a very interesting time. Obviously, the United States is going through a period of pretty radical reorganization here, but I do think that in general, for most of us, if you've grown up in the United States, this is sort of this is your normal operating mode, and really getting out of that and seeing what everyone else is up to and seeing how other people are living. I encourage you to do that. And I know there's lots of study abroad programs at SUNY Oneonta and others, but I also just encourage people not just to do it as like a tourist. It's great to go on a trip, but it's actually better to really kind of dig in and figure out how do other cultures structure themselves. I think the other thing I would say is I think sometimes people think like, oh, that must have been so nice, and you just had like a year to like figure yourself out. No, I was working full time. I was going to school full time. And I think the thing that I would just tell you is like, I was pretty afraid and overwhelmed like every single day for like a large part of that whole year. And I think the thing that I remember and just I would share with you is just that ultimately being in that state of having to figure stuff out constantly is really the only thing that makes you grow. Staying in your comfort zone and doing what you've always done certainly doesn't bring you to those other levels of experience. So that's what I did before I got to SUNY Oneonta. Then I deferred admission and I got came to SUNY Oneonta, spent 3.5 years there. Certainly took what I would kind of call like full advantage of my time there. I graduated in 2010. I didn't realize until today how few photos I actually have of that time. This was before cell phones had cameras, so this was about all I could get for you. I did have 2 majors and 2 minors. The 2 majors were anthropology as a primary. I also double majored in political science, and I had 2 minors that I completed at the same time. I was basically taking 18 credit hours per semester. It was pretty booked. I was an RA in the residence halls for 3 years. I also ran the State Times, the campus newspaper back in the day. I did that for 3 years. I was also the admissions tour manager, and I had also just like a host of other bizarre jobs. I think what I would say about all of that is I felt like I tried to take the biggest advantage of what my time at Oneonta was. I did a bunch of things, didn't like everything. I can tell you that I was an RA for 3 years. It taught me a lot about how like that is not a good fit for me. Like I'm not meant to parent other young adults. Like that's just not really what I wanted to do with my life. So I think while you're there, I think the biggest thing is to take advantage of how much is available to you, the different experiences. It doesn't mean that you have to, be an admissions tour guide and then be a tour guide for the rest of your life. It's really, you don't have to, you can just try it out. And if you don't like it, you don't like it. It's no big deal. Making the jump to the real world post-graduation, I think this is typically what people ask probably about the most. I left Oneonta I graduated in December of 2010. And by February of 2011, I was employed full-time at the State University of New York. The State University of New York is the overarching state entity that manages all of the different SUNY campuses. So every campus has a president, and then there's a president of all the presidents, and that person is named the chancellor. And there was actually, while I was at Oneonta, there were a few folks from our campus who had been part of that search for the new chancellor. And so, these were like interviews with these candidates. And when the final candidate got hired, we got to meet her, and I actually ended up interning for her in the summer before graduation. And so when I finished my years at Oneonta, I had a couple job offers that I was sort of exploring and trying to figure out if those were right for me. And I ended up just like literally running into the chancellor, and she recognized me. and, was just sort of like, hey, what are you doing next? And I said, oh, I don't really know. I'm sort of like in between things. I'm not quite sure what I want to do. And we had just this really lovely conversation. And I basically just emailed her, no joke. I like emailed her that night and I was like, hey, so nice seeing you. Thanks so much for like being an advocate for students. At the time, this was like, there was a lot to do with like holding tuition steady and not raising prices. And the next morning I woke up and there was just an email in my inbox that was like, hey, would you like to come work for me? We'd love to have you here. You were a great intern and let's see what we can do. So I just think like, ultimately, I'm sure you've heard this 100 times, but like internships really do open doors for you. Sometimes it's the place you want to be, or sometimes again, you learn that that's not where you want to be. But I think the other thing I would just stress is like, you don't really know who you're going to end up running into. You never know when a connection can come back and be valuable to you, which I think is also just one of my biggest lessons learned from this time period. So I spent 7 years working there. I ended up managing a large portion of the education portfolio. So this was how SUNY schools were going to basically implement education policy. I worked my way up. I got promoted a couple different times. I sort of like found a bunch of different things that I was interested in. And through really big mentorship of the chancellor at the time, was able to sort of put together my own portfolio. All of that work, all of this is in Albany, New York. Obviously, the State University of New York is a state system, so it's part of New York State's infrastructure. And through that, I actually ended up a couple of different times in the room with the governor at the time, who was Andrew Cuomo. And he ended up asking me to come over and work for him in the governor's office. And I actually realized the photo on the left, this is actually Andrew Cuomo running for governor. And that person that you see on the right in a sweater is me asking him questions as a student journalist at SUNY Oneonta. So everything kind of like comes back full circle. So I ended up working for him. And I was put in charge of, at the time, what we referred to as the Education Reform Commission, which was basically the state government's K-12 education reform agenda. I spent about 1.5 years working on that. Didn't really enjoy that. Making a bunch of stakeholders feel important again, was just like not really my cup of tea. So after I finished putting together the report and we passed 10 recommendations into law, I left and I found another thing that I wanted to do. But I guess what I would say, like lessons learned from like my very, very early years, you really have to focus on like what skills do you actually have? What can you bring to a job? What kinds of jobs will you be sort of qualified for? The very first job that I took, a job with the chancellor, I was her speechwriter. And it's not because I had written speeches before, but it's actually because I had really good writing skills for my time running the campus newspaper. So you kind of just have to think about, I didn't end up in a career in journalism, but I did end up with a career in writing constantly because of those skills that I had. The second thing that I would say is it really matters what's going on around you. And I sort of broadly talk about like your environment. So when I graduated in 2010, it was the Great Recession. A lot of people were being laid off, mostly senior administrators, people whose paychecks were quite large, right? When you're in a budget cut situation, that's typically who gets to go first. And that is what I always said is like the recession created the best environment for me, because they were looking for people to do work that before very experienced people with 10 or 12 years of experience were doing. And then suddenly they needed to fill these jobs with very young people. I think that's very true of the environment that you guys are going into. Obviously, there's a lot of economic uncertainty. We're seeing the job market be pretty tough to get into. And I think that's just one of the pieces of advice I would tell you is like, just because other people are making cuts, it actually bodes very well for you because you will be lower on that pay scale and you'll end up with a job that you kind of like, in quotes, like shouldn't have when you're young, but it'll allow you to really learn a lot very, very fast. And that's, that'll be critical for you. The other thing I'll say is the first job that you end up, like, it doesn't define the rest of your life. I think I and others were really freaked out about this, and we really wanted to like find the most prestigious first job. And, you know, I think there's just a lot of pressure on that. I will tell you that people who have the quote unquote most prestigious jobs, most of them have sort of sputtered out career-wise. And a lot of us who sort of started with like what we found interesting have gone on to have really, really interesting careers. So certainly don't obsess over it very much. I think the biggest thing I would say is like focus on what you can learn in your first job. Having jobs that are a little bit not very describable are really useful because you end up doing a whole lot of different things all at once. The other thing I always tell people is like, these are really the first like 5-10 years of your career. These are really the years where like you can really hustle, you can really learn a lot, you can put in a lot of time and energy. Trust me, I am 35. The people who are starting to figure this out now and trying to hustle and have kids or have, you know, other responsibilities, it gets infinitely harder to put in that kind of time. You have the time and energy when you're young. I always recommend that people kind of go hardest right at the beginning. And then also just like, don't take yourself too seriously. But I will say like, be careful, just like know what's going on around you. Obviously, I worked for the governor. Now it's very well known, the kind of attitude and the kind of environment that it was. At the time, that really wasn't something that was talked about. That's part of the reason I left after a year and a half. So I always just feel like I have to say that is like, trust your gut when you're in a bad work environment and just go find another job. It's not worth your own personal safety and all that kind of good stuff. After that, I left the governor's office and I launched what's known as a place-based partnership. So I was the director of something that we called the Albany Promise. It was a public-private partnership aimed at figuring out how could we deliver economic mobility for the capital's most left behind populations, specifically thinking about kids and families. So it's an approach that we call cradle to career. So actually, this is a form of education reform where you actually look at the entire continuum all at once. You work across lots of different sectors. So we didn't just work with the K-12 education system. We worked with higher ed. We worked with healthcare. We worked with banks. We worked with all kinds of partners. I ran that partnership for quite a long time. It was a really interesting approach. We were bringing over a lot of what is now sort of thought of as sort of a public health approach. And we were bringing that into education reform. So that was like really fun and exciting. I had a great time. We ended up with some pretty amazing results. We saw high school graduation rates go up by 32%. We saw third grade reading rates go up by 22%. We saw college enrollment rates go up by 37%. And I ended up getting this award back in 2016. It's called the White House Champion of Change Award under the Obama administration. But I think it's always good to keep ourselves humble. This is the only picture I have of that day. And you can see me on the far left. My eyes are completely closed. So that I think is just a good reminder not to allow awards to go to your head. And that's another little lesson learned. Through a lot of that work that I did at the Albany Promise, I really ended up focusing on expanding 3-year-olds. First, it was 4-year-old full-day pre-K in the state of New York, and then expanding 3-year-old pre-K. And we were talking to a bunch of 3K providers, and we were having this conversation, and I just like couldn't understand. I was trying to solve a problem, and I was like, yeah, but like, where are kids under the age of 3? And this woman just looked at me and she goes, they're at their pediatrician's office. And if you can't change what happens in a pediatrician's office, 89% of brain development happens before age 3. She's like, you've already lost these kiddos. So I went over to the Department of Health. I marched over there and I started to get to know people, and I started to get to know how healthcare works, which was not something I had ever thought about, never something that I'd known anything about. And I ended up running into the Medicaid program, which actually you've probably heard a little bit about on the news lately. The Medicaid program is a federal-state partnership. It covers about 20% of the population. It's historically meant to cover folks and families who are low income and also children. People don't know this, but 1 in every 2 babies in New York State is born onto the Medicaid program. So it's quite a large program in New York State and in other states. So I got to know a whole lot about how does Medicaid work, what does it do, what does it not do, and I ended up taking a job at the Department of Health with the Medicaid director to run what we ended up calling the Medicaid redesign team, which was, as you probably guessed it, a reform initiative to figure out how do we expand the benefits to Medicaid to more individuals? How do we find efficiencies? In New York State, there are 90,000 healthcare providers. So this is a big job, big task. And one of the things we implemented while we were there is a different financing model in healthcare, which I will not bore you with the details of, but it is called value-based payment. The current system, or I should say the former system that we use, is called fee-for-service, where essentially doctors and hospitals make more money the sicker a population is, because the more healthcare they have to use, the more money that these folks make. Value-based care is a very different financial model. It's actually where hospitals and doctors actually make more money if they don't see patients because people are healthy and staying in their community. Over 5 years, we moved 80% of the Medicaid spending into value-based payments. And we also launched a really fun thing that I love and personally hold dear, which was called the first 1,000 days on Medicaid. First 1,000 days is about the first 3 years of life, where we reformed and augmented how much care children between the ages of 0 and 3 actually receive on the Medicaid program, and that continues to this day. So, little lessons learned from this part of what I was up to. I think the big thing I get a lot of questions about is how did you move from being in education and education policy into healthcare? And I think the biggest thing I always tell people is like, you just kind of like, there isn't a whole lot of rules out in the quote unquote real world. And I think the big thing I encourage people to do is like, do the thing you're not quite ready to do, because no one's really ready for anything. I certainly didn't feel super qualified to work for the Medicaid director. He controls, the largest line item in the state budget. And here I was, I had never worked in healthcare, but I sort of knew that if I showed up, worked hard enough, I could figure it out. And sure enough, I did that. I also think if you focus on hard skill development, that really helps you. You don't have to know every subject area. You just need to know some hard skills, and that really allows you to kind of come in and out of sectors as you want. I also think sort of what I call building your story, your career story. Sometimes people think of it as building your brand. By the time I got to the health department, people knew I hadn't spent time in healthcare, but people knew that I had solved other really big problems before. And so that gained me a lot of credibility while I figured out what the hell was going on in healthcare, frankly. And so that really helped me sort of get some credibility, and people let me kind of tool around in stuff that I sort of had no business doing. And then lastly, I would just say stay curious. You don't have to be stuck in one place. There's certainly people who do that. They pick one thing, perhaps, get an advanced degree, a PhD in it, and you sort of do that for your whole life. If that's not really what you're interested in, I just want to, let you know, most people have changed careers, have changed sectors, have done different jobs. It's not, you're not destined to stick in the very same place your entire career. After that, I left the Department of Health in 2018. The person on the left-hand side there, that's Jason Helgerson. He was the Medicaid director at the time. The two of us, just the two of us, launched our own consulting firm in 2018. That is officially 6 years ago now. And the picture on the right was us last year with our whole team. We have added since then. We now have 15 full-time employees. We work in the healthcare industry. We work on implementing value-based care, that thing that I was talking about earlier. I will say, shout out to Suni Onianta, Anthropology department. The young woman in the white jeans there in the front is also an anthropology graduate. Very similar story. She reached out to me. She was looking for an internship. I said, sure, why not? Come over. And she spent a couple years with us. She then took another job, and then she came back 2 years later, and she's been with us ever since. So again, internships and just reaching out to people really does the trick. I think Sally Han connected us, I'm pretty sure. 100% sure. The other thing that I do, because that doesn't feel like that's enough, I actually run a national center on post-secondary improvement at this organization called NASH, the National Association of Higher Education Systems. Again, this is me pulling over a lot of the processes and approaches that we use in healthcare over to the post-secondary space. I'm also an advisor to 4 startups in the healthcare space. And I also routinely, I do conferences, I do speaking engagements. I have what is commonly known now in the industry as a portfolio approach to my career, which just means you don't work for one single entity. You work for a couple different entities, and you get to balance and manage your time the way you want. Speaking of balancing and managing my time, about 1.5 years ago, post-pandemic, especially in healthcare, everything is very, very virtual. So I spend most of my day on the Zoom like this. And so about 1.5 years ago, I decided I wanted to relocate myself from New York, and I moved to Paris. And I also, very importantly, got a dog, and that's where I live now. So a lot of this has enabled me to have tremendous amounts of freedom. I still go back and forth to the United States quite a lot, but I have a lot of freedom in my life now, mostly because I own my own business, a couple businesses, and I do the work that I really, really enjoy doing. So there you go. That's the 60,000 foot view of what I've been up to. And I'll stop sharing.
Dog's Instagram, Tino, an American in Paris. All right, first of all, how many questions do you have? Yeah, go ahead.
Why Paris?
Why Paris?
That's a good question. 2 reasons, one personal and one work. So my mother is French. And so we grew up here when we were younger, coming over quite a lot. And then we just stopped coming here. So I've always enjoyed it. The second reason is that our consulting firm is opening a European line of business. And so being over here really facilitates that. It's easier for me to go to meetings, go to conferences and all that kind of good stuff. So we're looking to open essentially a Europe office.
Cool. Other questions you have? Tell us what a typical day looks like for you. I mean, maybe you don't have a typical day, but pick one.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so with the consultancy, I balance about 24 clients at any time. So most of my days are meetings with clients, because everybody wants your time. So as I mentioned, there's just a lot of Zooming, a lot of figuring out what people want. How do you help them find solutions to the problems that they have? The other thing that I spend a lot of time doing is writing. Writing is the other big part of my job, which I would also just urge everyone here. I'm sure you've heard this 1,000 times, but the best quality in a newly minted graduate is it being a good writer. That is somebody that I will hire in 4 seconds flat. I don't even care if you don't know anything about healthcare. I don't care if you don't know anything about the topic. If you're a good writer, like, I will hire you, because the number of good writers is very low in the working world. And the rest of it, as I sort of mentioned, the rest of it you can learn. You can learn everything else, but some core hard skills like writing and data analysis and all those kinds of things, those are the hard skills that are really, really important.
So you're Chief Solutions Officer. What does that mean?
Yeah, so when we started the consulting firm, we wanted to be very explicitly not a large firm. We wanted to be, we kind of joke internally, like we want to be the anti-McKinsey. Like we don't want to keep our clients forever and ever. We want to build up the muscle of our clients to find solutions to their problems. When I think about consulting, I think there's a bad reputation of consultants. It's like they say whatever they want and they'll just tell you to do things that like don't make sense. And I think for us, it was really important to be a consultancy focused on actual solutions. And if we can't find you a solution, if we can't solve your problem, this just isn't a good relationship for either of us. So we wanted to stay away from the title partner. I don't know if you guys know that, but partner is the typical sort of phrase or term that consultancies use if you own the firm. And we wanted to stay away from that because we thought that sent very corporate vibes. So we chose our own titles, and I came up with Chief Solutions Officer, and I've sort of been sticking with that the whole time.
Okay,
Yeah.
go ahead.
So what's been the biggest difference for you going from employee to like now owning your own businesses?
Oh my God. Owning your own business sounds like a great time. It's a ton of work. It's a ton of work because you have to be the business, right? Like I have to see my clients during the day. And then there's, like all of the work of running a business. So understanding finances is the biggest, and I will say, as someone who never thought they would run a business, I mean, I was in public service for 15 years. I never thought I would leave public service. And all of a sudden it was like, hey, let's start a business. And we had like neither of us. Now, I just want to like be dramatic for a second. Like Jason managed $1 billion. Like that's how big the Medicaid program is. And yet when we like started a business, we were like, do we need an Excel spreadsheet? Like, how does this, like, it's just a different world. You have to make payroll, right? Like we convinced people to leave their jobs. I always say this, like everyone who works for us has a family, has kids. I convinced them to leave other really stable, good paying jobs. I can't not make payroll. So I have to know at every moment, is there enough money? Do we have enough clients? Do we have too many clients? Do we need to hire? The skill set of being an entrepreneur is very different and it requires different kinds of hard skills. It's definitely something I wish I paid a little bit more attention to in college. I never took a math class. That's a story for another day. I was in like remedial math because I'm just so bad at it, but like I had never taken something that was like a little bit more applicable. So I had to learn. The benefit to like the environment that you guys are growing up in today, not to make myself sound 100 years old, but YouTube, like everything's out there. Even if you have to pay $100 for like a YouTube class, there's really good content on the internet now. None of that existed when I was in college. So it was like you either had taken a class in accounting for small business or you just didn't know how to do it. And so I think it's like, that's a lot of the work is like, you have your job, quote unquote, and then you have this like second shift of like making the business work. And it's not easy. We had to, when the pandemic hit, that first week we lost 4 clients. I mean, a lot of our bigger clients, they were large multinational corporations. And so the directive internally was like, yeah, there's a global pandemic. We are ending all contracts with outside consultancies because no one knew what was going to happen, and there's still a Excel spreadsheet floating around. I didn't know how else to manage it. So I was like, okay, green, yellow, red. Like these are the things, here's how we can cut cost right now. Here's how we can cut costs to the business if things get worse. And then there was this like infamous red column where I was like, sell everyone's pets. And like, it was a joke, but people took it very negatively. So don't do that. Don't do that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say, well, we're like in charge of our own destiny. Obviously, nobody's an island. So who's somebody that you would want to thank for where you are today in your life?
Oh my God, that's such a good question. Oh man, so many people. I couldn't agree more. I think there's like there's a thousand little interactions, especially as I think back to like being in college. Like there was all these interactions that you're kind of constantly having, people sort of nudging you in different directions. And I think it's natural to say like, oh, I don't need that piece of advice, or like that's not going to be me. You know, there's someone who like very early told me in a session kind of like this one, someone was like, networking is everything. Build your network. Make sure you keep in touch with people. And I remember sitting in that session and being like, I don't need to network. Like, I'll get by on my own skills. And then it was like very quickly after that, I was like, yeah, no, networks are everything. You really do need to keep in contact with people. And so I just think it's like, there's stuff that's probably kind of passing you by today, but you will like figure it out and be like, okay, that person was right. And so you're taking in a lot of passive advice. I think in terms of like people at the university, you know, the president of the university, this is like a long time ago, Dr. Klanuski back in the day, she's been gone for probably a million years, but I was the editor of the student newspaper, and I was sort of well known for running these like kind of like, I asked a lot of questions, let's just say that. Like there was a year where like faculty were getting cut, and then like I got wind that like all the administrators were getting a raise, and like she took me very seriously, and she was like, okay, that's a fair question, and like, yes, we can have an interview and we can sit down. And like she treated me very much like not just like a student, but like very much like, okay, if you're going to play hardball, then here's everything you have to understand about businesses and how universities work and why this is the case. And she was also just a very nice person. I don't know if Dr. Rutherford is still in the department, but he was great. I took a lot of his classes, but I think he also ultimately helped me understand. He was a bioanthro. He really oversaw that part of the program, and he also really helped me understand that like that's not what I was going to do with my life. And so even though I think he enjoyed having me in class, he helped me understand like, yeah, that's not it for you. And then Tracy's class, which was very tough. Which
class was it?
Oh, it was the bones class.
Oh, the bones class.
I still have like this memory. I think there's just people, especially in your college career, that like they don't lower the bar for you. And like I think I got a little used to like sweet talking my way through things. And then Tracy's like, no, you have to learn these bones. Like that's it. I'm not gonna pass you because you're like fun. Like you have to learn this. And I was just like, okay. And then I just like showed up constantly to like literally every office hour, and I was like, I have to learn these bones and I gotta pass this class. And that was just a good lesson that like not everything is easy, and also you can do it. You just have to apply yourself.
Yeah. So you were talking about like how you had that like extreme hustle in those 3 years that you were here. You did all of those different groups and clubs, the newspaper and the admissions and the RA, like when do you think in your adult life post graduation that you actually got like a day off or like time to enjoy your life rather than just working all the time?
I'm still waiting on it. No, I'm just kidding. That's a really good question. I think it's a little bit in my nature. Like I'm very curious about a lot of things. So I tend not to say no to things. I mean, if you kind of realized it was like, okay, she works in healthcare. And then it was like, or also she works in higher ed. Like that was someone from my past, from SUNY, coming to me and being like, Juliette, you know, there's this really incredible opportunity. Like, are you interested? And of course I was like, yes, of course. Do I have the time for it? No, not really. But like, I will find the time to do interesting stuff. I will say, and I think this goes back to the gentleman's question, is like when you own your own business, when you no longer work for someone else, you do control your time in a different way. You know, you have to be careful with that. You can't run a business and never show up to work because you won't have a business. But over time, you know, it's been a few years, it's been about 6 years since we started the consultancy. Like, you know, we give ourselves and all of our employees, like we have an unlimited time off policy. You know, it's like, you got to not drop client projects, but I really do encourage the folks who work for us and myself to have like a pretty good work-life balance. But when I'm on, I'm kind of on full throttle, drinking from a fire hose. And then I also just take a lot of time off too. So I guess the answer to your question is 35. I don't know.
Time for, I think, one more question.
What piece of advice would you give to seniors graduating?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the biggest thing is don't panic about what everyone says about the job market. It's not, it's hard because I think people mean well and they're trying to say, and they're trying to say things to you like, oh, it's a really tight job market. It's always a tight job market, to be honest. It's always hard. But as I said, actually, it's easier as someone who's coming into the job market. It's harder when you're 10 years in and you're trying to find something, with a salary level that you need to. I mean, that's the other thing, you guys, is you don't have a lot of, I'm hoping, expenses. You should be leaving a state university with not a whole lot of debt and also just not a lot of expenses, right? You don't need to live in downtown Manhattan. You don't need all of these things. And that's the other big piece of advice I wish someone had given me was live very humbly when you're early on, because your salary will increase. But if you start living at outside of your means early on, I saw a lot of people do that. And then, it got harder and harder. My first job, I was paid $35,000 a year. That's crazy. That's nothing. That's no money at all. But I figured it out, I lived in a tiny apartment. All of my clothes were from H&M. It wasn't this super glamorous lifestyle, but I worked a lot and I worked to advance myself quickly. And I just think that, the headlines about tight job markets and all this stuff, just remember that that's on a meta level. They're looking at jobs all across the country. They're looking at big trends. You need to think about, don't worry about that. Just think about yourself. What are you trying to do? What skills are you trying to acquire? Where can you go find those skills? And yeah, be kind of okay with taking not a great salary. You will make it up in spades over time.
Good. All right. Great questions, everyone. Well, Juliette, thank you so much for your time today. I really, really appreciate it. I think everyone does. Let's give her one more round of applause. Thank you. Juliette, I'll be in touch again, I'm sure. So, and we're going to share the recording. So if students want to check into that, and your information's on there as well, if somebody wants to reach out. So thank you very much.
Sure. Good luck, everybody.
Right.